So we're on to the last two essays. So basically decolonization in the Commonwealth. So first one of these is that economic weakness was the main reason why Britain decolonized. How far do you agree? So again, the factors would be economic weakness, changing political attitudes in Britain, and the rise of nationalist movements. So those are kind of the three controversial, like the three, sorry, controversial, three main factors for this one. So it's randomly three-factor essay as well, when most of them have been two-sided essays so far. So this one's more of a three-factor one. So we have to actually come up with which one we think is the most important, whereas before we've just been like, was it not? Um, so I'll set out the cases for three of them, then kind of put across which one we think it is. So economic weakness, why was that a factor in decolonization? Well, Britain had exploited the colonies during the war, as they had done all the time anyway, under their mercantilist systems. They'd always exploited them through forcing them to buy products they don't necessarily want for more money than they want to pay. But these economic exploitations had caused a lot of resentment in countries like Kenya. So there was like a big drive towards um, pushing for independence because um, they'd done damage to these countries' economies outside. Um, Britain relied on resources from its colonies. So they did make money for it, but at this point there was only two parts of the empire that were really like profitable for them, which was Singapore and Bengal. So everything else they were paying for. And I think that the basic collapse of Britain as a global superpower made it difficult for them to maintain the military and infrastructure needed for the empire. They also couldn't supply investment capital and manufactured goods anymore. They need what they were manufacturing, they had to sell at home. They didn't have anything to exploit. And the problem when you're in a mercantilist system is these countries were obliged to buy products from Britain, but Britain no longer had the industrial capacity to make these products, which makes for a catastrophic system. Um, and I think that the the argument why you could say it wasn't the most important factor is that the economy was at its weakest point at the end of World War II, and most countries were given independence later. But I think there was definitely a case that Britain just found it unsustainable economically to continue its empire, and therefore would have to decolonize. Anything you want to add on that? Or
Well, I mean, the complicating factor is that it's not just Britain, but it's also France,
yeah,
right? And there are other European countries too,
yeah,
that are involved in decolonisation. So, okay, yeah, let's keep that on one side
yep.
and then
Yeah, okay,
compare
we'll
it to
go
the
through
other
them and then we can
factors.
discuss it. So changing political attitudes in Britain is also quite important. So even though there were some British officials that still did not trust non-white countries to govern themselves and thought they would need time to develop their governance, you can see that most commonly with Churchill. Churchill genuinely believed that non-white countries couldn't run themselves, especially India. So he was very opposed to self-governance in India. But in general, I think the attitude was shifting. Like Labour in general came in and they didn't have that interest. Like Labour under Attlee would basically believe that British citizens needed the money spent in Britain on the welfare state more than on colonial maintenance. For them, like dealing with the situation of the poor in Britain and making Britain a better country was more important than grand imperial ambitions around the world, and that it was unsustainable in that period. Um, Also, Britain recognized its international commitments required it to grant independence to its colonies, both through the United Nations and the Atlantic Charter. They were kind of being pushed into it. And I think there was a general understanding that social Darwinism was no longer really acceptable. The white man's burden was a problem, that like countries had the right. It's very contradictory for the Britain and America at the end of World War One to be like countries have the right to like self-determination, but not inside the British Empire. I think it was quite difficult to square. This ideas of freedom, democracy, like rule of the governed, none of these things were applying to the British Empire. And I think you can see that acceptance come into the Conservative Party when Macmillan gives his Winds of Change speech in the South African Parliament to basically say, like, the continent is changing, the world is changing, we need to move with it. So, like, Labour was always on board for kind of ending the empire, but I think once a Conservative Prime Minister starts talking about ending the empire, I think that's the end game pretty much coming. Um, and they did try to bind them economically before independence in the Commonwealth, but had limited success as well. So it was like basically there was a large movement for independence. There were alternatives. There was a Cold War on. This imperialistic idea was much more difficult to maintain. You know, when Britain was the undisputed global superpower, it was easier. By now, when they're weakened to third, fourth most powerful country in the world, it's much harder to maintain. And the other big thing that was happening was the rise of nationalist movements. So that white superiority or like colonial dominance on social Darwinism was quite prominent, but was really challenged by the Japanese. He had come initially in the 1905 revolution when the Japanese had beaten the Russians. It was the first time a white European power had lost to an Asian power. But I think Japan's complete and utter basically evisceration of all of the Western European colonies, like from the Indonesia, from the Dutch, from Vietnam, from the French, from Malaysia, Singapore, from the British, and like the fall of Singapore in 1942. Seen as the impregnable fortress that was taken by the Japanese started to challenge it. The fact that Japan beat so many white countries made it clear to other countries, why are we, suffering under this white rule when they're not invincible? They can be removed. Um, and then they were starting to chafe against mercantilism, which is the same as the Americans had done with their own American Revolution, which we looked at last time. But now the colonies had been prevented from buying manufacturing goods from other countries or even manufacturing their own goods, which really annoyed them. And I think there was this sense of movement to like, we want to control our own destiny now. And they're seeing it in, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War One, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like there's a lot of movements of nationalism everywhere. Um, War had led to greater unrest in India and Indian independence after the push from Congress. And like the Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, Salt March and the movement for independence in India had really influenced a lot of other movements around the world. And the fact that India had got its independence in 48 and pushed to be the first non-white ex-colony to get out of the British Empire made it much easier, and was succeeding afterwards, made it easier for them to push. And like you also had in 1955 the non-aligned movement and worldwide challenge to white supremacy led by people like NASA and African American, merging them with African Americans in the United States. And then I think the Suez Crisis really caps that because, again, Britain is humiliated. They have to withdraw from Suez. And I think Suez is really got to be the main realization. It's no coincidence that Macmillan's Winds of Change speech comes 4 years after Suez, because I think it's where the British realize this is up. There's no way we can kind of maintain this afterwards. And there was a lot of international pressure. So the US had really wanted the UK to maintain its empire to resist countries turning communist at first. So they'd gone from FDR and the anti-imperialist movement to being actually we need it as a bulwark against the Soviets, to again be realizing that Britain was just too weak to look after this empire. And then the Americans had to put in resources into these former colonies to counter Soviet Union propaganda, which forced the Americans to deal with their own era inside. So I think all these things are kind of coming together at the same time. But I would
Yeah.
say it's the economic weakness that leads, for me, the driving force. Because I think if they were strong enough economically and militarily, they'd have cracked down on the nationalist movements if they wanted to, as they did throughout all the rest of the time period before this period in time. It's not like nationalist movements suddenly came at this point in time. It's just I think there was more sympathy to them and more lack of willpower to crush them. And I think that the economic weakness is what led to Labour and Attlee coming in, and that shift in the idea that, why we need to prioritize spending at home, I would say. What do you reckon?
I would say the rise of nationalist movements,
Oh, go on then.
actually, because I think that decolonization could have occurred in different ways.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so without nationalism, if we take that factor away, then, for example, that the possibility to have, say, a Commonwealth with
Yeah.
greater independence would be more probable.
Yeah.
But in fact, as a matter of fact, you
You're
get
talking about
aggressive.
like the what were they called? Dominions, like South Africa,
Yes,
Australia, New
exactly.
Zealand, Canada.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I think, but with nationalist movements, with very aggressive leaders, most of whom were educated in nice university, good universities in Britain or the
Yeah.
US, they were able to get a lot of momentum. They were able to organize, and of course, it's not that the other factors are not important. I think economic weakness, military weakness, and also sympathy,
Yeah.
in Britain and in the West to the national movements, means that the resistance is not there. But I really think, an alternative, and I've been listening at the moment to the history of the Algerian War.
Yeah.
The French were very determined to hold on. They did all they could.
And in Vietnam as well.
And in Vietnam as well. And they couldn't. I think the nationalist movements are very strong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they occur. That I mean, you see so many different versions of national movements
Yeah,
in Africa and in Asia, in the um, you know, in the outside of Europe.
yeah,
That I would say that's probably for me the main factor.
yeah,
Why they're so successful and why they have so much traction,
yeah.
that's quite a complicated argument,
Mm,
right? Because philosophically, they have much more credibility, I think, in the 50, in the 60s, particularly 60s and 70s.
yeah,
And as you say, they in a way have they have resonances with, say, civil rights.
yeah,
I think people in the West are very sympathetic. I mean, I think sections of people in the West are very sympathetic to the nationalist movements against their own governments.
yeah.
So anyway, so that's my argument. I would go for the third one.
Well, I think the rise of the working class vote makes a difference to that as well, because the working class has always been exploited by the elites in the West anyway. So therefore, I think they're more sympathetic to people who've been exploited by the elites outside
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's. I think you can argue for any of these three, and you can make the case because they all interlock.
yes,
So again,
they
it's
do.
whichever way you want to go with it, as long
They're
as
all pointing in the same direction, aren't they?
they
That's the thing.
are.
It's
And
not.
then,
It's not as if there's someone determined in Britain to hold on to the empire. It's not like,
well, Churchill,
the question of, well, like the question of home rule, for example, or a
Churchill.
question of India. No, no, yeah, I know, but Churchill was a man, in some ways, a man of the 19th century, right?
Yeah, he was
Still,
Victorian
still
era.
had,
No, yeah,
still had that Victorian progressivism.
yeah,
I think in the 50s and 60s, it's a very, very different situation here. And I think the winds, the overwhelming direction, the overwhelming movement is towards the nationalist movements and the aims that they aspire to, independence. Unfortunately, it leads to all sorts of terrible things, I think, in many cases. But
yeah,
um, uh, yeah, so okay, so that would be my
I
position.
think you got points there in terms of like, I mean, Churchill's grandson came in to speak to our students, and they were asking him like, what would he most regret? And he said he thinks his grandfather would have most thought he was on the wrong side of that argument on decolonization.
Yeah, I don't know. That sounds. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, it was a different time.
Yeah,
It was a
well,
different time, so it's hard to
he was
judge.
prime minister from 51 to 55, so no, Attlee had made those arguments.
True, but it's still hard to judge. I mean,
Yeah,
sure, I'm not going to. I'm be the last one to defend pro-colonial attitudes, but
yeah.
in some ways, it's understandable
Mm.
where people like Churchill gets his position from, but you couldn't have Churchill's position in the 60s.
No.
It'd be absurd to do that. It's unthinkable.
There are people who have Churchill's position today.
Yes, but not
No,
okay, but not that's not it's not I don't
not
think it's
many, and they're
politically
usually quite
credible. I
posh.
don't think it's politically credible. I don't think there was any section in British politics.
Oh, you
You
know that
know.
there was like one of the Brexit arguments was that they could recreate the Commonwealth.
Really? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
well, yeah, sure.
a
As a
white
Commonwealth.
English-speaking empire is what they wanted to recreate. Some of them.
Really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. That's why
Okay.
they gave special visa privileges to white colonies, to like white South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians. You know
I
that
don't know how,
Trump.
yeah, but I don't know how that term is increasingly inaccurate, I think, true in Australia, because we have
Yes,
a lot of immigration
but Trump is
for a long time.
isn't Trump
It's like Canada too.
Musk is pushing for white South Africans to be declared as refugees for America so they can get visas.
I'm not sure. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I read that.
So,
I don't
okay.
know. Yeah.
All right. So,
Last
yeah,
question. How well did Britain
good.
deal, speaking of that nature, how well did Britain deal with the changing nature of the
Good
Commonwealth?
segue. Good
Yeah,
segue.
yeah, there you go. So we're right into the last one. So this is how well do they deal with it? This is again is successful or not successful for each one. I broke it down to British actions, independence of the colonies, and the crises that they had to deal with. So we'll look at British actions first. So how were they successful in dealing with the changing nature? Well, they successfully managed to keep most of the former colonies within the Commonwealth, which is kind of weird because I think as far as I'm aware, it's the only one where like all the former colonies have kind of signed up to a new program. So like there a lot of peaceful transitions, like
Yes.
into independence as opposed to fighting it. Um, They fought many wars, particularly the Korean War, with the support of the Commonwealth troops. The Commonwealth troops are still rallying to them. The monarch still remains the head of the Commonwealth, which means you guys down there and Canada still have the king's face on your currency.
We
Like,
do.
yeah, there's no cash
We
in it.
had in Australia, there was a referendum about whether to become a republic,
Yeah.
and it failed.
What was the vote? Do you know?
I can't remember. I think it was fairly decisive,
Yeah.
the no vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Canadians were upset that the king wasn't defending them against becoming the 51st state. So, um, and then so Britain had a couple of problems with this. So they sacrificed the Commonwealth though, and its preferential trade deals with the when they joined the EEC in
Yes.
1973. So that was one of the
Yeah.
key things they had to do to abandon New Zealand lamb in favor of like joining the European Union. Although obviously our bigger trade partner by miles is the Europeans, doesn't matter. But I think one of the biggest damages was the 1962 Commonwealth Immigration Act, because it was designed to limit black immigration into Britain, specifically designed to, that was the one I was talking about, restricting to mostly white immigration
Yeah.
coming in. So that looks pretty racist and isn't like a particularly, under the Conservative government, doesn't really look good in terms of dealing with the changing nature of Commonwealth. But that's countered by in 1971 when they make the Singapore Declaration that condemns all forms of racism within the Commonwealth,
Yeah.
which is obviously a
Yeah.
shot across the bow also as well to what would then have been Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and what we talked about earlier in the Wilson one. And then the
Yeah.
Commonwealth Charter of 2012, although it's outside of our course, states that members share democratic values, international peace, equal rights, and individual freedom. So there's a a reinforced aim to make sure that the values of the Commonwealth are spread. I think the British actions were pretty successful in handling the Commonwealth because the fact that actually just lots of people stayed in it. You know what I mean? It's like that's quite an impressive achievement to get a bunch of countries you exploited for a long, long, long time to still stay inside and take
Mm.
like the economic benefits of the system once they've left. Would you agree or
Okay.
not? As a Commonwealth member?
As a member, well, I mean, I think it's also true that uh, what does it mean to be a member of the Commonwealth?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't mean the only the
Not
only
a
time
lot
I see
now,
it,
but it would
not
have
a
been
lot.
good.
That's the
When
thing.
before
That's right.
1973, it would have meant you got economic benefits, so the countries could have been in like Britain was in the EU. But now I'm not sure it's
Indeed.
a lot. It's more cultural.
And there are things like the Five Eyes
Yeah,
Defence Act, right?
for now.
Okay, but in practice, I mean, I
Mm.
think the World War II, I think was a good demonstration of Australia's independence
Yeah,
from Britain in the fact that we took all our troops out of Singapore
yeah,
to defend the mainland. Well,
yeah,
not all of them, but many of them against the wishes of Churchill
yeah.
and the British, and there was nothing that they could do about it.
Mm.
So I don't think there's any sense, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think there's any sense. It's not an issue, it's not a political issue. There was one blip in Australia. I'm sorry, I don't want to go into a big digression about Australian history, but
That's fine.
we did have a constitutional crisis in Australia in the under the Prime Ministership of Gough Whitlam, where he was fired by the Governor General.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously the Governor General is the Queen's direct
When were they
representative
fired? When was it
of the
fired? I'm
King's.
not familiar with Australian history at that level. We have a Mackenzie's Institute of Australian History in London, but I never took any units there. When
Yeah,
did this happen?
this was in just let me 1975.
Oh wow, they could still fire someone in 75.
Yeah, I think yeah,
Wow. I know
yeah.
that
So
the Commonwealth court cases are still brought to the to the highest court of Commonwealth disputes in England. And didn't we interfere
right,
with Papua New Guinea recently?
really,
I think we
yeah,
did something in their elections in Papua New Guinea. We did something with, I can't remember what exactly it was. But like yeah, the Governor General still has some influence in these places. But yeah, I
yeah.
think it's more of a
So
brotherhood of shared values now, the Commonwealth, no? As in like because they still share theoretically, like you said, the British values as much as you can. Then the other thing they had to deal with was the independence of the colonies. So white ruled nations of Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand were granted independence in 1931, but retained economic and strategic ties to Britain. So again,
Yeah.
that, I think, is the base of the Commonwealth. It was the giving those nations dominion status. Also shows in the 30s how quite racist the British were because, like, I don't think you can justify giving it only to the white ruled nations on any other grounds other than pure social Darwinism there. And then there's a certain degree of flexibility as well because um, the India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka joined the Commonwealth as republics, but kept the monarch as the head of the Commonwealth. So again, there was flexibility. You didn't have to retain the king as your head of state. And the rapid dismantling of the empire in Asia and Africa between 1957 and 64, which is obviously Millen's Winds of Change speech, changed the nature of the Commonwealth, but it survived. So the fact that this seemingly archaic grouping of former British colonies, the only thing they share in common was they were colonies of Britain, and yet they still have their sporting Commonwealth games and other stuff, and this institution still survives. I don't know what its real purpose is, other than a kind of symbolic thing, and for a sport.
Perhaps shared history
Yeah,
and shared political identity, which is not affected really in any dramatic way by, say, British exploitation or anything like
not
that.
anymore. No, we couldn't even if we wanted to
No,
exploit.
exactly. That's right.
Yeah,
So
don't have the
I
power.
think we're left with symbolic gestures,
Yeah,
and it so happens that the symbolism is palatable to,
yeah,
I guess, to the majority of people in the Commonwealth.
yeah. And the last thing then was how did they deal with the crises that they happened? Say, start with the negatives because it was mostly negative earlier on. Suez Crisis caused disunity because Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa supported Britain. You doing it. Well, India, Pakistan sympathized with Egypt, which shows
Yeah,
again that real division between what the former white colonies and and basically those who were in the non-aligned movement with NASA. So,
yeah.
and I assume that's because Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa were quite often colonized by English colonizers, whereas Britain and Pakistan, India and Pakistan were obviously victims of that and probably have like recall of those events in terms of them going into the Suez Crisis. So it shows the divide there but I think Suez is the last time Britain goes full on imperialist. And then
Well,
that
I don't think it's. I mean, I don't think it's imperialistic. I think that's a slur.
imperialistic mindset.
I think it's a. No, I think it's a
Yeah.
slur that has traction at the time
Yeah.
because it looks really bad. I don't
Yeah.
think. My impression is that there were actually pretty good reasons for protecting the Suez Canal, just as there are good reasons for protecting the
Yes,
Panama Canal.
but NASA hadn't actually
I,
done anything with it yet. You know what I mean? So it's not like it was an anticipation of a threat.
I'm not suggesting that the response was appropriate or
Yeah,
certainly was. I mean, obviously it wasn't.
yeah,
But I don't think that the motivation, I mean, whatever the motivation was, I think there are several possibilities. And and it's very hard to really believe that it's imperial. Is it imperialism?
yeah,
That doesn't, I
yeah.
mean,
Fair enough, but it can certainly be portrayed that way. It's certainly.
absolutely can be portrayed that way and
I think it's
was
the. Well,
successfully.
let me rephrase why I think it's the arrogance of the British to think they can just do it because it's
Yeah.
contravening international law.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
The
that I think,
illegality of it
yeah,
is
that I
is
think is a
nothing.
legacy of imperialistic mindset that they feel they can go over international law with no consequences.
Yeah. Man. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I need to read up more on it. But
Yeah.
it's very easy to use. Yeah. The,
1961, South Africa leaves the
yeah.
Commonwealth over criticism over
All
apartheid,
right.
criticized for arming them and not imposing economic sanctions. And
Yeah.
again, the Commonwealth was against Britain's handling of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe as well. So obviously these two countries are like slightly problematic with their like white supremacist doctrine ideologies that they had running through them. So I think like the fact that Britain doesn't boot them out is kind of the handling of apartheid's a bit ugly if you compare to the 71 Singapore Declaration condemning all forms of racism within the Commonwealth. I don't
Mhm.
think you can see apartheid as anything other than racism.
Mhm.
I think you'd be hard pushed to make the case that apartheid is not racist.
I think
Um,
you would.
given that they categorize people in four racial categories, you get something like that. I think it's pretty much
So,
the close to a definition of racism as you can get. So I think the handling of South Africa is a little bit difficult. But the fact that Mandela rejoins the Commonwealth as soon as the apartheid regime has ended suggests there was no resentment against Britain. No. So they don't take it personally. And Mandela obviously is part of his Truth and Reconciliation campaign, so that was really important with that. I think a very interesting one is that Mozambique and Cameroon, obviously Portuguese and French colonies, become the first members with no history of ties to Britain, which is rather weird. But the fact that two countries that were not members of the British Empire at all joined the Commonwealth in 1995 suggests that it's been handled pretty well, because it's obviously a
yeah,
competitive club
I
that
had no
kind
idea
of,
about that.
huh?
I had no idea that was the
No,
case.
me neither. But like the fact that, it's got to be handled well if you can bring in countries that, if Mandela just rejoins straight away, you've got countries with real resentment to Britain for what they did to them colonially that are members of the Commonwealth,
Yeah.
which is, I
Okay.
suppose you have to say, is pretty well handled to be able to have countries that you've trashed or done terrible things
Yeah.
in colonial times become
I
members of the
mean,
position.
given what you would expect the disappearance of the Commonwealth, would you? That would be
Yeah,
an alternative history that it's
yeah.
not too hard to conceive of, and the fact that the Commonwealth still exists
And it's expanding.
and is expanding is probably a decent sign that it's being
Yeah,
dealt with pretty well. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's the only multilateral organization that's expanding
Yes. That's
outside. So yeah, so shall we say that they handled it pretty well, actually?
why not? Why not?
Yeah, apart from apartheid South Africa and Zimbabwe.
Well, can't have everything.
No, but I think everything else they
So,
kind of handled reasonably well. Certainly in the
all
later
right.
years. All right, cool.
Bravo.
I think we have finished that one. Let me just, where's the stop button?